In the depths of a medieval winter, when frost claimed both earth and flesh, one man's bare feet marked a path through snow that history would never record, until now. Hello, dear friend. As you settle into the warmth of your bed tonight, let me take you back across the centuries to a world where winter was not merely a season, but a test of human endurance. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift into a time when survival itself was the greatest achievement any common person could hope for. This is a story of hardship, yes, but also of the quiet strength that lives in the human heart, even in the darkest and coldest of times. In the year of our Lord 1347, in the rolling lands of Sussex in southern England, there lived a man named Thomas Ashfeld. He was 31 years old that winter, though the hard years of his life had etched lines into his face that might have belonged to a man of 50. Thomas was neither tall nor short, standing at about 5 feet and 6 inches, with shoulders that had grown broad from a lifetime of labor. His hair, once a rich chestnut brown, had already begun to show threads of gray at his temples, and his hands were massive things, scarred and calloused, the knuckles permanently swollen from years of gripping tools in all weather. But it was his feet that told the truest story of his life, cracked, hardened, with toenails blackened from repeated injury, soles so thick with callus that they resembled leather more than human flesh. These were the feet of a man who had walked barefoot through countless winters, for Thomas Ashfeld owned no shoes, and he never had. He belonged to the manor of Sir William Grayson, a knight who served the Earl of Arundel, and like his father before him and his father's father before that, Thomas was bound to the land as surely as the ancient oak trees that marked the boundaries of the Lord's fields. He was a villein, what some called a serf, though Thomas himself rarely thought in such terms. He simply was what he was, a man who worked the land he could never own, who lived in a cottage he could never truly call his own, whose very children belonged in law to the lord of the manor. Thomas lived with his wife Alice and their 3 children in a cottage at the edge of the village. The cottage was small, perhaps 15 feet by 12, with walls of wattle and daub, woven hazel branches covered in a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. The roof was thatch, blackened with age and smoke, and it leaked in a dozen places that Alice constantly tried to repair with whatever materials she could find. There was one room, which served as kitchen, workroom, and bedroom all at once. The floor was simply packed earth, covered with rushes that Alice changed when she could gather fresh ones from the river bank. In one corner stood their most valuable possession, a small iron cooking pot that had belonged to Alice's mother. In another corner was the bed, a wooden frame filled with a mattress of straw, where the whole family slept together for warmth. The children, young William, age 9, Margaret, age 6, and baby Edmund, just 14 months, shared the bed with their parents, all huddled together under thin woolen blankets that Alice had woven herself on their small loom. The cottage had one small window, covered with a wooden shutter that they kept closed during winter to preserve warmth, and a door made of rough planks that hung slightly crooked on its leather hinges. In the center of the room was the hearth, the heart of their home, where a small fire burned day and night. They kept the fire as small as they dared, for fuel was precious. Thomas was allowed to gather fallen wood from the Lord's forest, but taking any living branch, even a small one, could result in a heavy fine or worse. So they burned mostly turf and dried animal dung, which gave off a thick, acrid smoke that filled the cottage and made their eyes water. The smoke found its way out slowly through the thatch and the many gaps in the walls, leaving everything inside coated with a layer of black soot. This was the world Thomas had always known. He had been born in this village, in a cottage much like the one he now lived in, the fourth son of a man who had worked the same strips of land that Thomas now worked. As a fourth son, Thomas had inherited nothing. No land, no tools, no prospects. His oldest brother, John, had inherited their father's holding when the old man died of a fever 12 years ago. His second brother, Roger, had died as a child, carried off by the flux. His third brother, Peter, had been taken by the Lord for service when the king called for men to fight in France, and no one had heard from him since. That was 6 years ago now, and Alice sometimes said prayers for Peter's soul, assuming he had long since fallen to a French sword or English disease. Thomas had married Alice when he was 23 and she was 16. She was the daughter of a widow woman who lived in the village, and though Alice had no land or dowry to bring to the marriage, Thomas had counted himself fortunate to find a wife at all. Alice was a good woman, strong, capable, and patient with the hardships that came with being married to a man who owned nothing. She had dark hair that she kept covered with a linen coif, brown eyes that still held kindness despite everything she had seen, and hands as work-worn as Thomas's own. She could spin and weave, she could brew ale, she could tend a garden, she could keep a cottage and raise children and make a little food stretch further than seemed possible. In the early years of their marriage, Thomas had sometimes watched her work and felt something warm in his chest, a feeling he had no words for but which he knew was love of a kind. The children were the center of Alice's world. Young William was a serious boy, already learning to work alongside his father in the fields. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's broad shoulders, and Thomas saw in him the same future he himself had lived, a life of endless labor, of aching muscles and empty belly, of obligations that could never be fully met. Margaret was a bright child, quick and curious, always asking questions that Thomas had no answers for. She had Alice's brown eyes and a gap between her front teeth that showed when she smiled, which was often, despite everything. Baby Edmund was still at his mother's breast, a fat, healthy child who seemed to cry less than the other two had at his age. Thomas loved all three of them with a fierce intensity that sometimes frightened him, for he knew how easily children could be taken by disease, by hunger, by accident, by the 100 dangers that lurked in every season. But now it was winter, the winter of 1347, and this winter was proving to be particularly brutal. The cold had come early, settling over the land in late October like a heavy cloak that would not be shaken off. By November, the ground had frozen solid, and the first snows had come. Not the light, pretty snows that melted in a day, but heavy, wet snows that fell for days at a time and piled high against the cottages and in the lanes between the houses. The village, which in summer had been a place of green fields and busy activity, had become a huddle of dark shapes against an endless expanse of white. Thomas had faced many winters in his 31 years, but this one felt different. The harvest had been poor. Too much rain in the summer had rotted much of the grain in the fields, and what they had managed to bring in had been thin and sparse. The Lord's steward had still taken the same portions for the manor, of course, as well as the church's tithe, which left even less than usual for the villeins to keep for themselves. Thomas's family had begun the winter with only half the grain they needed to last until spring, and Alice had already put them all on reduced rations. Breakfast was a thin porridge of oats, dinner was a piece of dark bread with perhaps an onion, and supper was a weak pottage of whatever vegetables they had left: dried peas, some turnips, the last of the leeks from Alice's garden. The children cried from hunger sometimes, especially little Margaret, and there was nothing Thomas could do except tell them that spring would come, that things would get better, though he was not sure he believed it himself anymore. And now, in mid-December, as the days grew shortest and darkest, Thomas faced his greatest dread: the winter work that could not be avoided, no matter how deep the snow or how bitter the cold. The Lord's land needed tending even in winter, and as a villain, Thomas owed labor service on that land. He owed 3 days per week throughout the year, and additional days during harvest time and other busy seasons. In winter, that meant hauling manure from the manor's stables to spread on the fields, cutting and hauling wood, repairing fences and buildings, clearing snow from pathways, and 100 other tasks that the Lord required. And all of this work had to be done before Thomas could attend to his own family's needs, his own cottage, his own tiny plot of land. The worst part, the part that filled Thomas with a dread that sat like a stone in his belly, was that he had to do this work barefoot. He had no shoes. He had never had shoes. Shoes were expensive. A pair of leather boots might cost as much as Thomas could earn in several months, even if he had any coin to earn, which he did not. The villeins worked for their lord in exchange for the right to farm their own strips of land, not for money. Occasionally, Thomas might earn a few pennies by doing extra work for the manor or for wealthier villagers, but such coins were rare and precious, saved for emergencies like paying the Lord's fines or buying salt. Shoes were an unthinkable luxury, something that belonged to the world of knights and merchants and prosperous freemen, not to people like Thomas. In summer and autumn, going barefoot was merely uncomfortable. Thomas's feet were so toughened by years of exposure that he could walk across stubbled fields or rough paths without much pain. But winter was different. Winter was an agony that Thomas endured because he had no choice. When the snow lay thick on the ground and the frost made the earth as hard as stone, when the wind cut through his thin woolen tunic and leggings like knives made of ice, Thomas still had to work. He still had to rise in the darkness before dawn, eat his meager breakfast, kiss Alice and the children goodbye, and make his way to the Lord's fields or forest or wherever he was required that day. And he had to do it on bare feet that sank into snow, that stepped on ice, that slowly lost all feeling until they seemed to belong to someone else entirely. This morning, this cold, dark, terrible morning, was one of those days. Thomas had woken to find frost thick on the inside of the cottage walls, his breath visible in the air even near the small fire that Alice kept burning through the night. Outside, he could hear the wind howling around the corners of the cottage, and he knew without looking that more snow had fallen in the night. He lay still for a moment, pressed against Alice's warm back, feeling Edmund's small body curled against his chest, and he wished with all his heart that he could simply stay here, stay warm, stay with his family. But he knew the steward would come looking for him if he did not appear for work, and the punishment for shirking labor service could be severe. A fine they could not afford to pay, time in the stocks, even a whipping if the Lord was in an ill temper. So Thomas had carefully extracted himself from the tangle of his sleeping family, trying not to wake them, though Alice's eyes had opened as he moved. She said nothing, but he saw the worry in her face as she watched him dress in the dim light of the fire. He pulled on his tunic, made of rough, undyed wool that Alice had spun and woven herself, then his leggings, which were wrapped and tied with strips of cloth since he had no proper hose. Over this, he put on his outer tunic, slightly longer, and wrapped a piece of old cloth around his neck and shoulders as a poor substitute for a cloak. He had a woolen cap that Alice had made for him, which he pulled down over his ears. And then there was nothing else to put on, nothing else between him and the winter except his own flesh, his own toughened skin, his own ability to endure. Alice had risen silently and ladled out a small bowl of cold porridge left over from the night before. Thomas ate it quickly, barely tasting it, knowing he needed something in his belly before the long day ahead. She handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a piece of bread and a bit of cheese, his dinner, which he would eat in whatever shelter he could find during the brief rest period the steward allowed. He took it gratefully, tucked it inside his tunic against his chest to keep it from freezing, and then he stood by the door, delaying the moment when he would have to open it and face the cold. Alice came to him, rising on her toes to kiss his cold, roughened cheek. "Come home safe," she whispered, as she did every morning. It was not empty words. Men did die from the cold, from accidents, from exhaustion. Everyone knew someone who had not come home from a day's winter work. "I will," Thomas promised, as he always did, and then he pushed open the door and stepped out into the winter darkness. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making him gasp. The snow was knee-deep outside the cottage door, and more was falling, thick white flakes that swirled in the wind and stung his face. The village was still dark, though here and there he could see the faint glow of firelight through cracks in shuttered windows, showing where other families were beginning to stir. The sky above was that peculiar dark gray of winter dawn, neither night nor day, and Thomas knew it would be another hour or more before the sun rose, if it could even be seen through the heavy clouds. He stepped forward, and the snow closed around his bare feet like a cold mouth. The shock of it never lessened, no matter how many winters he endured. For the first few moments, it felt like his feet were burning, the cold so intense it registered as heat. He gasped, his breath coming in short clouds of white vapor, and forced himself to take another step, and another. The path to the manor was perhaps a mile from his cottage, leading through the village and then along the edge of the common fields. In summer, it was an easy walk of 20 minutes or so. In winter, in snow like this, it could take an hour, and every step was a small torture. Thomas had learned long ago that the only way to survive this was to not think about it too much. He let his mind go distant, focusing on the rhythm of his steps, on keeping his balance in the deep snow, on avoiding the hidden ruts and stones that could turn an ankle or cause a fall. Around him, other men were emerging from their cottages, hunched against the wind, dark shapes moving through the white landscape like ghosts. Some called out greetings as they passed, but most were silent, saving their energy for the work ahead. After the first few minutes, Thomas's feet began to go numb, which was both a blessing and a curse. The pain lessened, replaced by a strange wooden feeling, as if he were walking on blocks instead of flesh. But the numbness brought its own dangers. He could not feel where he was stepping, could not tell if he had cut his foot on a sharp stone hidden beneath the snow or if he was developing frostbite. He had seen men lose toes, even whole feet, to the cold, and he knew he had to be careful. Every so often, he would stop and stamp his feet, trying to force blood back into them, trying to maintain some feeling, some connection to these parts of himself that he depended on so completely. The village slowly came alive around him as he walked. He passed the church, its stone walls dark and solid against the snow, and he saw Father Benedict hurrying from the priest's house toward the church door, his black robes hitched up above his ankles to keep them out of the snow. The priest at least had shoes, good leather boots that came up to his calves. Thomas felt no resentment at this, only a dull acceptance. Of course the priest had shoes. The priest was an educated man, a man of God, a man who did not work with his hands. It was the natural order of things, or so Thomas had always been told. He passed the alehouse, closed and shuttered at this early hour, though he knew that by evening it would be full of men seeking warmth and the forgetfulness that came with ale. He passed the houses of the wealthier villagers, the smith, the miller, the reeve, their cottages larger and sturdier than his own. He passed the common ovens, cold now, but which would be fired up later in the day so that the village women could bring their bread to bake. And finally, he reached the edge of the village and began the long walk along the field path toward the manor house. The field stretched out on either side of him, covered in an unbroken expanse of white. In the growing light, Thomas could see the shapes of the land, the ridge where the best soil lay, the hollows where water collected, the strips divided among the various villein families. That one there, the third from the path, that was his family strip, where he would plant barley in the spring if God granted them another spring. The sight of it filled him with a complicated mixture of feelings, pride that he had land to work, even if he didn't own it, exhaustion at the thought of all the labor it required, anxiety about whether this year's crop would be any better than the last. The land was both his livelihood and his prison, the thing that kept his family fed and the thing that bound him in servitude. By the time Thomas reached the manor house, the sun was finally rising, though it was barely visible through the clouds and falling snow. The manor was a substantial building of timber and stone, 2 stories high, with a great hall, separate chambers for the lord's family, kitchens, storerooms, and stables. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Thomas could smell bread baking, meat roasting, the sense of plenty that made his empty stomach clench with hunger. Around the manor house were various outbuildings, barns, storage sheds, workshops, and it was to one of these that Thomas made his way, to the barn where the steward held the morning gathering of workers. Inside the barn, perhaps 20 men were already assembled, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands, their breath forming clouds in the air. The barn was marginally warmer than outside, sheltered from the wind, but it was still bitterly cold. Thomas found a place to stand near his friend, Hugh Carpenter, a man of about his own age, who held a small parcel of land on the other side of the village. "Bad morning," Hugh said quietly, and Thomas nodded agreement. There was no point in discussing how bad it was. They both knew. The steward, Master Geoffrey, arrived shortly after, a sharp-faced man in his 40s with a warm wool cloak and good leather boots. He carried a wax tablet and stylus, which he consulted as he called out the day's assignments. "Thomas Ashfeld, you'll be on the wood detail," he announced. "Hugh Carpenter, the same. There's trees down in the north wood from yesterday's wind. Need them cut and hauled to the manor." Thomas's heart sank. Wood detail meant a day in the forest, which was at least a mile beyond the manor, and it meant swinging an axe and hauling heavy logs in deep snow. It was perhaps the hardest of the winter work assignments, and he had been hopping for something closer, warmer, easier. But there was no arguing with the steward. He simply nodded and fell in with the group of men assigned to the same task. They set out together, perhaps 8 of them, led by one of the manor's regular servants, a man named Jack who carried the tools they would need: axes, ropes, a large 2-man saw. The walk to the forest was long and difficult, the snow even deeper away from the trodden paths of the village. Thomas's feet had gone completely numb now, and he walked with a strange stamping gait, lifting his legs high to pull his feet free of the snow with each step. The cold had worked its way up his legs, and he could feel the bite of it on his thighs, his hips, his belly. He wrapped his arms around himself and hunched forward against the wind, but there was no escaping it. When they finally reached the forest, Thomas was gasping with exhaustion, and they hadn't even begun the real work yet. The forest was a different world in winter, the trees bare and skeletal, their branches heavy with snow, the undergrowth buried beneath white drifts. In the dim light beneath the canopy, everything was gray and white and black, a world leached of color. Jack led them to where several large trees had fallen, likely oaks, their roots pulled from the frozen earth by the force of the wind. They were massive trees, and Thomas knew it would take all day to cut them into manageable pieces and haul them back to the manor. Jack distributed the tools, and the work began. Thomas partnered with Hugh on one of the large saws, a fearsome blade nearly 5 feet long with wicked teeth. They positioned themselves on opposite sides of the fallen trunk and began the rhythmic work of pulling the saw back and forth, back and forth. It was hard labor that quickly warmed the body, and Thomas was grateful for the warmth even as his muscles began to burn with the effort. The saw bit into the wood slowly, producing a pile of sawdust that fell onto the snow like golden powder. The sound of sawing filled the forest, the rasp and scrape of metal on wood, punctuated by the occasional grunt of effort from the men. They worked for hours without stopping, the rhythm of the saw becoming almost meditative in its repetition. Pull, push, pull, push. Thomas's arms ached, his back screamed with pain, and his hands, even through the calluses, began to blister from gripping the rough wooden handle. But he kept working, kept pulling, because to stop would mean he wasn't fulfilling his labor obligation, and that could mean punishment. Around midday, Jack finally called a halt, and the men collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to even seek shelter. Thomas's entire body trembled with fatigue, and when he tried to walk, his legs wobbled beneath him like a newborn calf's. He found a relatively dry spot beneath one of the standing trees and lowered himself carefully to the ground, his back against the trunk. Only then did he remember his feet. He looked down and felt his stomach lurch. His feet were blue-white, crusted with snow and ice, and he could not feel them at all. When he tried to wiggle his toes, nothing happened. For a moment, panic seized him. Had he waited too long? Had he lost them? He had seen it happen to others, seen the blackened flesh that meant death had already claimed fingers or toes, seen the fever that followed, seen men die from wounds that seemed so small and insignificant. With shaking hands, Thomas began to brush the snow from his feet, then pressed his palms against the icy flesh, trying to warm them with what little heat his own body could provide. Hugh, seeing what he was doing, moved closer and without a word, opened his own tunic and gestured for Thomas to put his feet against his belly, against the warmth of his skin. "No, Hugh, I couldn't," Thomas began, but Hugh cut him off. "Don't be a fool. You'll lose them if you don't warm them now. Put your feet here." So Thomas did, pressing his frozen feet against Hugh's warm stomach, and Hugh gasped at the shock of cold but did not pull away. They sat like that for several minutes, an awkward embrace born of desperate necessity, while around them the other men did the same, helping each other, sharing what warmth they had, because they all knew that tomorrow it might be them who needed help, them whose feet had gone dangerously cold. Slowly, painfully, feeling began to return to Thomas's feet, and with it came an agony worse than the cold had been. It felt as if someone was driving hot needles into his flesh, as if his feet were being held over a fire. He bit down on his lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood, his whole body rigid with the effort of enduring the pain. Hugh held him steady, one hand on his shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. They both knew this was simply part of the price they paid for being born as they were. When Thomas could finally bear to look at his feet again, he saw that color was returning, a mottled red and white that looked angry and inflamed, but at least it was not the black of frostbite. His toes were all still moving when he commanded them to, though the movement sent fresh waves of pain through him. He had survived this time, but he knew he had been close, dangerously close. He pulled his feet back and nodded his thanks to Hugh, who simply nodded in return and closed his tunic against the cold. Then Thomas reached inside his own tunic and pulled out the bundle Alice had given him that morning. The bread was frozen solid, the cheese hard as a stone, but he broke off pieces and gnawed at them anyway, barely tasting them, just needing something in his belly. He shared half with Hugh, who had no food of his own. His wife had died the previous winter, and he lived alone now with his elderly mother, who was too frail to prepare much in the way of food. The brief rest was over too soon. Jack called them back to work, and Thomas forced himself to stand, forced his legs to hold him, forced his feet to take his weight even though every step sent sharp pains shooting up his legs. They returned to the sawing, and the afternoon was a blur of exhaustion and cold and relentless effort. The world narrowed to the simple task before him: pull the saw, push the saw, pull, push. His mind drifted away from his body, a trick he had learned long ago, a way of surviving when survival seemed impossible. He thought of Alice's face, of young William's serious expression, of Margaret's gap-toothed smile, of baby Edmund's warm weight in his arms. He thought of summer days when the sun was warm and the fields were green. He thought of anything except where he was and what he was doing. By the time Jack finally called an end to the work, the light was already fading from the sky. They had managed to cut the fallen trees into sections and had hauled several loads back to the manor, but much remained to be done. It would be another day of the same tomorrow, or perhaps 2 days or 3. Thomas no longer cared. He could think only of getting home, of getting warm, of seeing his family. The walk back was even harder than the walk out had been. Thomas was so exhausted that he stumbled frequently, and twice he fell face first into the snow and lay there for a moment, wondering if he could simply stay there, simply let the cold take him. But each time, Hugh or one of the other men pulled him to his feet, and he kept walking, kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and he was not ready to die, not yet. Not when Alice and the children needed him. By the time he reached the village, full darkness had fallen, and the temperature had dropped even further. The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally across the fields, and Thomas could barely see more than a few feet ahead of him. He navigated by memory and instinct, following the familiar path toward his cottage. His feet were numb again, completely without feeling, and he knew he was in danger, knew he needed to get warm soon, but it seemed to take forever to cover the last few hundred yards. When he finally pushed open the cottage door, the warmth and light inside seemed like a vision of paradise. Alice was there immediately, crying out in alarm when she saw him, calling for William to help. Together they got him to the bed, and Alice began pulling off his frozen outer garments while William stirred up the fire and added precious fuel to make it burn hotter. Margaret stood to the side, her eyes wide with fear, and baby Edmund, sensing the tension in the room, began to cry. Alice's hands moved over Thomas's body, checking for frostbite, for injury, her face tight with worry. When she reached his feet, she made a small sound of distress. "Thomas, your feet, they're so cold. Can you feel them at all?" He shook his head, unable to speak, his jaw clenched tight to keep his teeth from chattering. Alice called for William to bring snow, clean snow from just outside the door, and when the boy brought it in a wooden bowl, she packed it around Thomas's feet. This was the old knowledge, passed down from generation to generation. Do not warm frozen flesh too quickly, or you could lose it. Start with snow, then gradually move to warmer and warmer treatments, giving the blood time to return slowly. Thomas lay back on the bed, shaking violently, while Alice worked on his feet. She rubbed them gently with the snow, then with her hands, then wrapped them in cloths that she had warmed by the fire. Margaret brought him a cup of weak ale, heated with a hot stone from the fire, and he sipped it gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. Slowly, gradually, his body began to thaw, and with the thawing came the pain, the terrible burning, stabbing pain of flesh coming back to life. He must have cried out because Alice was suddenly there, her face close to his, her hand on his cheek. "I know," she whispered. "I know it hurts. But it's good pain, Thomas. It means you're alive. It means you still have your feet." He nodded, unable to speak, and she held him while the pain crested and slowly began to ebb. The children huddled together near the fire, watching with frightened eyes, and Thomas tried to smile at them, tried to show them that he was all right, even though he felt as if he were dying. Eventually, the worst of the pain passed, leaving behind a dull ache and an exhaustion so profound that Thomas could barely keep his eyes open. Alice brought him a bowl of pottage, thin stuff made from dried peas and the last of their turnips, but hot and nourishing, and he ate it mechanically, hardly tasting it. Then she helped him under the blankets, and the children climbed in beside him, their small warm bodies pressed against his, sharing their heat. Before he fell asleep, Thomas looked at his family gathered around him, their faces illuminated by the firelight, and he felt something fierce and painful in his chest. Love, yes, but also fear. Fear of what tomorrow would bring, fear that he might not always make it home, fear that this winter might be the one that finally broke him. But he pushed the fear down, locked it away in some deep place inside himself, and focused instead on the warmth of his children, the sound of Alice moving about the cottage, the simple fact that he had survived another day. In the morning, he would have to do it all again. His feet would hurt, possibly worse than today, and the cold would be just as brutal, and the work just as hard. But that was tomorrow. Tonight he was home, he was alive, and his family was safe. It would have to be enough. The next day dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak underfoot and turned breath to ice crystals in the air. Thomas woke before dawn as always and immediately knew something was wrong. His feet were throbbing, a deep ache that pulsed with every heartbeat, and when he tried to stand, pain shot up his legs so sharply that he gasped and nearly fell. Alice was awake in an instant, steadying him. "Let me see," she said, and in the dim firelight she unwrapped his feet to examine them. What she saw made her face go pale. The flesh was swollen and angry red in places, with patches of purple bruising spreading across his soles and up around his ankles. Several of his toes were blistered, the skin raised and filled with fluid. But most worrying were the areas of white, dead-looking skin on his heels and the balls of his feet, the unmistakable signs of frostbite. "Thomas, you can't go out today," Alice said firmly. "Your feet need time to heal. If you go out again like this, you could lose them entirely." Thomas looked at his feet, then at Alice's worried face, and felt despair wash over him. She was right. He knew she was right, but how could he not go? If he failed to appear for his labor service, the steward would fine him, and they had no money to pay a fine. The penalty might be worse than money. It could be time in the stocks, exposure to public humiliation, or even a whipping. And if the Lord decided that Thomas was an unreliable worker, he could take away their land holding, could turn them out of the cottage. Where would they go then? What would they do? "I have to go," he said quietly. "Alice, you know I have to go." "Then you'll go to your death," she replied, her voice shaking. "Thomas, please. One day. Just take one day to let them heal, even a little." They looked at each other across the dim cottage, husband and wife, both knowing the impossible choice before them. Stay home and face punishment, possibly ruin. Go out and risk permanent injury, possibly death. There was no good choice, no safe choice. There was only survival and the question of how much one was willing to sacrifice for it. In the end, it was young William who made the decision. The boy had been listening from the bed, and now he spoke up, his voice high but determined. "Father, I'll go in your place. I can do the work. I've been learning." Thomas turned to look at his son, this child of 9 years who was already so serious, so burdened with understanding beyond his years. "No, William. You're too young. The work is too hard." "I'm strong," William insisted. "And I've been working with you in the fields. I know how to use tools. I can do it, Father. Please." Alice's face was torn, clearly divided between wanting to protect her husband and wanting to protect her child. But Thomas saw something else in her expression too, a recognition that William's offer might be their only option. The boy would have to work soon enough anyway. Most boys began their labor service by age 10 or 11. William was nearly old enough, and he was big for his age, strong from the work he already did helping his father. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision crushing him. To send his son out into that cold, into that brutal labor, went against every protective instinct he had. But to go himself in his current state was to risk leaving his family without a father at all. And if he stayed home without sending someone in his place, they risked losing everything. "All right," he said finally, the words like ashes in his mouth. "All right, William. But you'll take Hugh with you. Find him and tell him what's happened. He'll look after you. And you'll come home at midday, you understand? Not a full day. Just half a day, and then you come straight home." William's face lit up with a mixture of pride and fear, and Thomas saw his son properly for the first time in a long while, saw that he was no longer quite a child, that the hardness of their life was already shaping him into the man he would become. It broke Thomas's heart. Alice prepared William as she had prepared Thomas countless times before, layering him in what warm clothes they had, giving him a piece of bread to eat, wrapping a small bundle of food for his dinner. She fussed over him, adjusting his cap, retying the strips of cloth that held his leggings in place, and Thomas could see tears in her eyes that she was trying to hide. William bore it all patiently, then knelt before his father for a blessing. Thomas placed his hand on his son's head, feeling the boy's dark hair beneath his palm, and tried to think of something to say, some wisdom to impart. But all he could manage was, "Be careful. Do what Hugh tells you. Come home safe." "I will, Father," William promised, and then he was gone, slipping out into the cold darkness before any of them could change their minds. After he left, the cottage seemed terribly quiet. Alice sat by the fire, staring into the flames, and Thomas lay on the bed with his feet propped up, feeling useless and afraid. Margaret came and curled up beside him, and he held her close, grateful for her warmth and her presence. Baby Edmund nursed at Alice's breast, oblivious to the tension in the room, and for a while they all simply sat in silence, waiting for the hours to pass, waiting for William to come home. Thomas spent the day in a haze of pain and worry. Alice tended his feet as best she could, applying poultices made from herbs she had dried the previous summer, yarrow to stop bleeding, comfrey to help healing, willow bark for pain. She changed the cloths frequently, keeping his feet clean and wrapped. The blisters she left alone, knowing that they would heal better if not disturbed, but she watched the areas of frostbite with deep concern, praying that they would not turn black, that the flesh would not die and rot. Thomas tried to make himself useful despite his immobility. He mended a broken tool handle. He helped Margaret learn to spin wool on a small spindle Alice had made for her. He even held Edmund for a while to give Alice a rest. But mostly he lay there, listening to the wind howl around the cottage, watching the weak winter light move across the walls, and thinking about his son out there in the cold, working in his place. Midday came and went, and William did not return. Thomas tried not to panic, tried to tell himself that the boy had probably been kept longer by the steward, or that he was making his way home slowly in the snow. But as the afternoon wore on and darkness began to fall again, Thomas's worry turned to something deeper and more primal. Alice paced the cottage, going to the door every few minutes to peer out into the gathering gloom, and even Margaret grew quiet and anxious, sensing her parents' fear. When the door finally opened and William stumbled in, Thomas nearly wept with relief. The boy was gray-faced with exhaustion, his lips blue with cold, but he was alive. He was home. Alice rushed to him, pulling off his frozen outer garments, checking him for injury, while Thomas called out questions from the bed. "What happened? Why are you so late? Are you hurt?" William shook his head, his teeth chattering too hard for him to speak at first. Alice got him to the fire and wrapped him in a blanket, and gradually the boy's shaking subsided enough for him to talk. "The steward kept us late," he said. "We were cutting wood again, and he wanted another load brought back before we could leave. Hugh tried to argue that I should be let go early, but the steward wouldn't hear it. Said a worker is a worker, doesn't matter the age." Thomas felt anger burn in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Anger would do no good. The steward was simply doing his job, ensuring the Lord got his due labor. That was how the world worked. "Did Hugh look after you?" he asked instead. William nodded. "He did, Father. He showed me how to swing the axe properly, and he made sure I didn't hurt myself. And at midday, he shared his food with me and helped me warm my feet." The boy paused, then added quietly, "My feet hurt, Father. They hurt terrible." Alice immediately turned her attention to William's feet, and Thomas saw her face tighten as she examined them. The boy's feet were not as badly damaged as Thomas's, but they were red and swollen, and there were signs of frostbite on his toes. William was young, his flesh not yet toughened by years of exposure, and the cold had bitten him hard. "You're not going back out tomorrow," Alice said firmly, looking at both her husband and her son. "I don't care what the steward says. I don't care what the fine is. You're both staying home until you're healed, and that's the end of it." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to explain again why they couldn't afford to defy the Lord's requirements, but he was too tired, and his feet hurt too much, and he had just spent an entire day terrified that his son might not come home. So instead he just nodded and said, "All right, Alice. All right." That night they all slept together in a tight huddle, the whole family pressed close for warmth and comfort. Thomas held William against his chest, feeling the boy's heartbeat, feeling him breathe, and sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever powers might be listening. They had survived another day. It would have to be enough. But the next morning brought new troubles. Thomas woke to find his feet worse, not better. The swelling had increased, and the areas of frostbite had spread. When Alice unwrapped them, she made a small sound of distress, and Thomas knew it was bad without even looking. The pain was constant now, a deep throbbing ache that made it impossible to think of anything else. "I need to get you to the cunning woman," Alice said. "Mother Agnes. She knows more about frostbite than I do. She might have something that can help." Mother Agnes lived on the far side of the village, in a cottage even smaller and more dilapidated than their own. She was ancient. No one knew exactly how old, but some said she remembered back to the old king's father's time. She had been the village healer for longer than anyone could recall, the woman who delivered bobbies and set broken bones and prepared the dead for burial. Some whispered that she was a witch, that she knew dark magic, but most people simply saw her as a necessary presence, someone who understood the body's mysteries in ways that even the priest did not. Alice left Thomas in William's care and went out into the cold to fetch Mother Agnes. She was gone for what seemed like hours, and Thomas drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, his feet burning despite the cold, his dreams troubled and dark. When Alice finally returned, she brought the old woman with her, and Thomas roused himself enough to greet her. Mother Agnes was a tiny thing, bent nearly double with age, her face so wrinkled it looked like crumpled parchment. But her eyes were sharp and bright, and her hands, when she unwrapped Thomas's feet, were surprisingly gentle. She examined him in silence for a long moment, pressing here and there, watching his reactions, and Thomas could see the concern in her expression. "You've come close," she said finally, her voice cracked with age. "Very close. Another day or two out in that cold and you'd have lost them for certain." She reached into the leather bag she carried and pulled out various items: a small clay pot of salve, a bundle of dried herbs, a vial of dark liquid. "This salve is made from goose grease and comfrey. You'll apply it twice daily to the frostbitten areas. And this," she held up the herbs, "you'll make into a tea and drink it 3 times a day. It will help with the pain and bring down the swelling." "What's in the tea?" Alice asked, always careful about what she gave her family. "Willow bark, meadowsweet, and a few other things," Mother Agnes replied. "Nothing harmful, I promise you. I've been making this tea for 60 years and it's never yet killed anyone." She paused, then added more quietly, "As for the vial, that's poppy juice, but use it sparingly. Only if the pain becomes unbearable. It's powerful stuff, and I don't have much to spare." Alice took the items carefully, nodding her understanding. "Thank you, Mother Agnes. What do we owe you?" The old woman waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing now. You can bring me a few eggs in the spring when your hens start laying again, or some vegetables from your garden when they come in. I don't need payment in winter. Winter is hard enough for everyone." After Mother Agnes left, Alice prepared the tea and helped Thomas drink it, then applied the salve to his feet with careful, gentle strokes. The salve was cool and soothing, and within a short time, Thomas felt the pain begin to ease slightly. It was still there, still a constant presence, but it had pulled back from the unbearable level it had reached. For 3 days, Thomas and William stayed inside the cottage while their feet slowly healed. It was a strange, suspended time, cut off from the normal rhythm of their lives. Alice rationed their food even more strictly, knowing that without Thomas working, they had no way to earn or gather anything extra. They ate once a day now, a thin porridge in the morning and nothing else until the next morning. The children cried from hunger, and Alice and Thomas went to bed each night with their bellies cramping and empty, but there was nothing to be done. This was simply how it was. On the 4th day, there was a knock at the door. Thomas's heart sank, knowing what it would be. Alice opened the door to find Master Geoffrey, the steward, standing outside with a disapproving expression on his face. "Thomas Ashfeld," he said formally, "you have failed to appear for your labor service for 3 days. The fine for such absence is 12 pence, to be paid immediately. 12 pence. It might as well have been 12 pounds. Thomas had never held that much money in his life. He struggled to sit up, his feet still too damaged to support his weight, and tried to explain. "Master Geoffrey, I would have come if I could. But my feet, the frostbite, I couldn't walk. I'm sorry, truly I am." The steward's expression didn't soften. Illness and injury are not excuses under the law. You owe labor service, and when you cannot provide it, you owe compensation. 12 pence, or I'll have to report this to Sir William, and he may decide on further punishment. Alice stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "We don't have 12 pence. We don't have any pence. Surely you can see that, Master Geoffrey. Look at us. Look at this cottage. Do we look like people who have 12 pence hidden away?" The steward looked around the cottage, taking in the poverty that surrounded him. The thin blankets, the bare walls, the near-empty storage bins, the 3 hungry children. His expression shifted slightly, not quite to sympathy, but perhaps to a kind of weary recognition. He, too, was just doing his job, following rules that had been set by others, rules that had been in place since before any of them were born. "Then how do you propose to settle this debt?" he asked. Thomas and Alice looked at each other, both knowing they had nothing to offer. Their few possessions, the cooking pot, the loom, the bed, were necessary for survival. They couldn't give them up. They had no animals to sell, no goods to trade. There was only one thing they had that was of any value to the manor. "Take our grain," Thomas said quietly. "What we have left stored for winter. Take it as payment." Alice gasped and the steward frowned. "That grain is for your family's survival. If I take it, what will you eat?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. But it's all we have to give. Unless you want to take the children for service." It was not entirely a joke. Children could be taken into service in the manor house, working as servants, and their labor would count toward their family's obligations. But such children rarely saw their families again, and Thomas knew he would rather die than give up his children. Master Geoffrey was silent for a long moment, and Thomas could see the man struggling with his conscience. Finally, he sighed. "Keep your grain. I'll mark the debt as owed, and you can work it off when you're recovered. Extra days beyond your normal service until the debt is paid." He paused, then added, "But Thomas, you cannot miss service again. Next time there will be no leniency. Sir William is not a patient man, and these are difficult times for everyone. The manor needs every worker at full strength." "I understand," Thomas said. "Thank you, Master Geoffrey. I'll be back as soon as I'm able." After the steward left, Thomas and Alice sat in silence, both understanding what this meant. The debt would take months to work off, perhaps an entire year of extra days. It meant less time for their own land, less time for their own needs, more exhaustion, more hunger, more hardship. But at least they still had their grain, still had something to keep the children fed through the worst of winter. Thomas returned to work a week later, though his feet were still tender and painful. He had no choice. The debt weighed on him, and every day he stayed home was another day of labor owed, another burden added to the already crushing load. Alice wrapped his feet in extra layers of cloth before he left, and she had saved a bit of the goose grease salve to rub into the worst of the frostbitten areas. It helped, but not enough. Nothing could truly help except staying off his feet entirely, and that was a luxury Thomas could not afford. The winter continued its relentless march, and with each passing week, life grew harder. The cold never truly lifted, never gave them even a brief respite. January brought blizzards that lasted for days, burying the village under drifts so high that people had to tunnel paths between their cottages. February was even worse, with temperatures so bitter that the well froze solid and water had to be melted from snow. Thomas went out every morning into that frozen hell, his feet wrapped in their inadequate cloths, his body already weakened by hunger and exhaustion, and somehow he kept going. He learned new strategies for survival. He learned to move constantly while working, never standing still long enough for the cold to fully penetrate. He learned to recognize the warning signs of frostbite, the tingling, the numbness, the white patches on skin, and to take action before it was too late, stamping his feet, rubbing them with snow, seeking even brief moments of warmth. He learned which of the other workers could be trusted to help, who would share body heat during rest periods, who would keep watch to make sure no one fell behind on the walk home. Hugh remained his closest ally, and the two men looked after each other with the fierce loyalty of soldiers who had survived battle together. But Thomas also saw men fall. There was Robert Miller's son, a young man of 20, who collapsed in the fields one bitter morning and never rose again. The cold had stopped his heart, the village women said later, though who could truly know? There was old John, who had worked the manor lands for 50 years, who lost 3 toes to frostbite and died of fever 2 weeks later when the wounds turned putrid. There was Edmund Fletcher, who slipped on ice while hauling timber and broke his leg so badly that the bone tore through the skin. Mother Agnes had done what she could, but the wound would not heal in winter's cold, and Edmund lingered for weeks in agony before finally succumbing to infection. Each death was a reminder of how fragile they all were, how close to the edge they lived every single day. At the funerals, held in the village church with Father Benedict intoning prayers in Latin that none of them understood, Thomas would look around at the faces of his neighbors and see the same exhaustion, the same fear, the same grim determination to survive just one more day. They were all fighting the same battle, all walking the same knife's edge between life and death. At home, the situation grew increasingly desperate. By mid-February, their grain stores were almost gone. Alice had been stretching them as far as possible, making the porridge thinner and thinner, but there was only so much water you could add before you were eating nothing but warm liquid. The children were constantly hungry, their bellies distended, their arms and legs growing thin as sticks. Margaret had stopped playing, stopped asking questions, and instead sat by the fire with a blank expression that frightened Thomas more than her tears had. Even baby Edmund, who had been such a fat, happy child, was now irritable and fussy, crying for milk that Alice's body could no longer produce in sufficient quantity, for she herself was starving. Thomas began doing something he had sworn he would never do. He began stealing from the Lord's land. It started small. A turnip left behind in the field after harvest, half frozen but still edible. An apple from the manor's orchard, wrinkled and brown but still containing some nourishment. A handful of grain, accidentally spilled from a sack he was moving. Each theft was a risk that could result in severe punishment. The stocks, a whipping, even hanging if Sir William chose to make an example of him. But when Thomas looked at his children's hollow faces, at Alice's jutting ribs visible through her thin shift, he found that he could no longer care about the risk. Let them catch him, let them punish him. At least his family would have eaten one more meal. He was not alone in this. All around the village, people were doing the same, taking what they could when they could from wherever they could find it. The Lord's forest, which was supposed to be protected, was being stripped of anything edible. Bark was peeled from trees to be ground into flour. Roots were dug from the frozen ground. Men set snares for rabbits and birds, though such hunting was illegal for villeins. Women combed through the manor's waste heaps, searching for scraps of food that had been thrown away. It was a kind of quiet rebellion, born not of defiance but of desperation, and the manor's servants largely turned a blind eye to it. They, too, understood what hunger felt like, even if they were slightly better fed than the villeins. One evening in late February, Thomas came home to find Alice in tears. She was sitting by the fire, holding Edmund, and the baby was making a strange, weak mewing sound that Thomas had never heard before. "What's wrong?" he asked, though he already knew, already feared what she would say. "He won't eat," Alice sobbed. "I've been trying all day, but he won't latch, won't suckle. And when I finally got him to take a little, he just brought it all back up. Thomas, I think he's dying." Thomas felt his world tilt. He had been prepared for many things, for injury, for hunger, for the endless cold, but not for this, not for the death of his child. Edmund was barely a year and a half old, still a baby, still innocent of the cruelty of the world. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But fairness and rightness had nothing to do with survival in the winter of 1348. Thomas took his son from Alice and held him close, feeling how light the baby had become, how fragile. Edmund's eyes were half closed, and his skin had a grayish tinge that Thomas recognized from seeing other dying children. The boy was fatting, slipping away, and there was nothing Thomas could do to stop it. "We need to get him to Mother Agnes," he said, even though he knew it was probably useless. What could even the cunning woman do against starvation? Alice nodded and wrapped Edmund in their warmest blanket, and together they went out into the night, into the cold that seemed determined to kill everything it touched. The walk to Mother Agnes's cottage felt eternal, and with every step, Thomas prayed to God, to the Virgin Mary, to all the saints he could remember the names of, begging them to spare his child, promising anything, everything, if only Edmund could live. Mother Agnes took one look at Edmund and shook her head. "The child needs food," she said bluntly. "Real food, not just a starving mother's milk. He needs broth, gruel, something with substance. Without that, there's nothing I can do. No herbs or potions will cure an empty belly." "We have nothing," Alice whispered. "Our grain is almost gone. We've been eating once a day, and even that is mostly water." The old woman was silent for a long moment, and Thomas could see her weighing something in her mind. Finally, she went to her own small store of food, pathetically little, barely enough to keep her own ancient body alive, and measured out a small amount of oats into a cloth bag. "Take this," she said, pressing it into Alice's hands. "Make a thin gruel and feed it to the child slowly, just a spoonful at a time. His stomach has shrunk, and he won't be able to take much at once. And here," she added a small vial to the bag. "This is fennel water. It will help with the vomiting." Alice tried to protest, tried to say they couldn't take the old woman's food, but Mother Agnes waved her objections away. "I'm old. I don't need much to keep this bag of bones going. The child needs it more. Now go quickly, while he still has strength enough to swallow." They hurried home, and Alice immediately set to work preparing the gruel while Thomas held Edmund, trying to will his own life force into the fatting child. When the gruel was ready, Alice fed it to Edmund one careful spoonful at a time, and Thomas held his breath with each swallow, waiting to see if the baby would keep it down. The first 2 spoonfuls came back up almost immediately, and Alice's face crumpled with despair. But she persisted, trying again, and the 3rd spoonful stayed down, and the 4th, and the 5th. By the time Edmund had managed to eat a few tablespoons of the thin gruel, he seemed slightly more alert, his eyes focusing on his mother's face with something approaching awareness. They fed him like this throughout the night, small amounts every hour, and slowly, gradually, Edmund began to strengthen. By morning, he was nursing again, and though he was still desperately thin and weak, the grayish color had left his skin, and his cry had regained some of its strength. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, some terrible tension he hadn't even known he was carrying, and he pulled Alice into his arms and held her while she wept with relief. But the incident with Edmund was a turning point for Thomas. Something shifted inside him, some last vestige of acceptance or resignation breaking apart. He looked at his starving children, at his exhausted wife, at the hopeless future that stretched before them, and he felt anger, true, burning anger, for perhaps the first time in his life. What kind of world was this, where a man could work from dawn until dark, could give his labor and his sweat and his blood, and still watch his children starve? What kind of justice allowed lords to feast while their workers went hungry? What kind of God permitted such suffering? These were dangerous thoughts, heretical thoughts, the kind of thoughts that could get a man in serious trouble if spoken aloud. But Thomas couldn't help thinking them. They gnawed at him during his long days of labor, accompanied the rhythm of his work, filled the empty spaces in his mind where hope used to live. He began talking to the other men, carefully at first, testing their feelings. And he discovered that he was not alone in his anger. Hugh felt it too, as did many others. They whispered among themselves during brief rest periods, sharing stories of injustice, of cruel treatment by the manor's officials, of fines and punishments that seemed designed to keep them forever in debt and servitude. The anger was spreading like a fever through the village, made worse by the harsh winter and the constant hunger. It wasn't always this bad, old Geoffrey told them one day. He was the oldest worker still able to labor, perhaps 60 years old, and he remembered times that the younger men had never known. When I was a boy, back in good King Edward's grandfather's time, the harvest was better. The lords were not so demanding. A man could keep more of what he grew. And winters were milder then, or perhaps I just remember them that way because I was young and strong. What changed? Hugh asked. Old Geoffrey shrugged. Everything changes. The population grew, so there was more competition for land. The wars with France began, and the king needed money, so the lords needed money, so they squeezed us harder. The weather turned worse. You youngsters don't remember, but we used to grow grapes here, wine grapes. Can you imagine that? Now we can barely keep barley alive. The world is getting colder, harder, meaner. And we're supposed to just accept it, Thomas heard himself say. Just keep working and suffering until we drop dead in the fields. Old Geoffrey looked at him with tired eyes. What choice do we have? Rebellion means death. Running away means death. They'll track you down and hang you for breaking your bond to the Lord. We can endure or we can die. Those are the only choices we've ever had. But Thomas was no longer sure he could endure. The anger had taken root too deep, had grown too strong. He found himself fantasizing about violence, about striking the steward when he barked orders, about setting fire to the manor house, about taking up weapons and fighting back against the system that ground them down. He never spoke these fantasies aloud, but he could see similar thoughts in the eyes of the other men, could sense the same desperate energy building beneath the surface of their daily routines. March arrived, bringing with it the first tentative hints that winter might someday end. The days grew incrementally longer, the sun occasionally breaking through the clouds with something approaching warmth. The snow began to melt, turning the village lanes into rivers of mud and making the walk to the fields even more difficult in some ways. Thomas's feet, which had never fully healed from the worst of the frostbite, squelched through the freezing mud, and he developed sores and infections that Alice treated with poultices and prayers. But despite the slight improvement in weather, the food situation grew even more critical. The grain that was supposed to last until the first spring greens became available had run out entirely for many families, including Thomas's. They were now eating anything they could find, grass boiled until it was soft, tree bark ground into a powder and mixed with water, even dirt mixed with what little flour they could beg or steal, formed into small cakes and baked hard. Thomas grew weaker. He could feel it in his body. The way his legs trembled when he climbed even a small rise, the way his arms shook when he lifted anything heavy, the way his mind grew foggy and confused. He was starving, slowly but surely, and so was everyone else. The village was full of walking ghosts, people who looked more dead than alive, who moved through their days in a haze of hunger and exhaustion. And then in mid-March, a merchant passed through the village with news from the wider world, and everything else, even hunger, was temporarily forgotten in the face of what he told them. "There's a plague," the merchant said, speaking to a crowd that had gathered around him in the village square. "Started in the east, they say, in the lands of the Saracens. Spread west through Italy and France. It's in England now, reached the southern ports last summer and has been spreading since. They call it the Great Mortality or the Pestilence. People sicken and die within days, sometimes within hours. Whole towns have been wiped out. The dead are too numerous to bury." The crowd murmured in fear and disbelief. Father Benedict pushed his way to the front. "God's judgment," he proclaimed. "This is divine punishment for our sins. We must pray, do penance, seek forgiveness." But the merchant shook his head. "Prayer hasn't helped the places I've been. The plague takes the pious and the sinful alike, takes priests and nobles and beggars without distinction. I've seen things," he paused, his face going pale. "I've seen things I hope never to see again. Bodies piled in the streets, families dead in their beds, children orphaned and wandering like lost animals, and the signs of the disease, the buboes they call them. Great swellings in the neck, the armpits, the groin, black and oozing, and the fever, the vomiting of blood. It's like nothing anyone has seen before." Thomas listened to this with a strange feeling of detachment. Another threat, another danger, another way to die. What difference did it make? They were already dying of cold and hunger. Why not plague too? At least plague would be quick, from what the merchant described. Better than this slow starvation, this endless grinding misery. But as the merchant continued to speak, describing the spread of the plague, the places it had already reached, Thomas felt a new kind of fear taking hold. This wasn't just another hardship to endure. This was something that could end everything, could kill his family, could empty the village, could bring about the end of the world as they knew it. "How far away is it?" someone in the crowd called out. "It was in Bristol a month ago," the merchant replied. "And in London 2 weeks past. It's moving fast, following the roads, the trade routes. I wouldn't be surprised if it reaches this area within weeks, maybe sooner." The crowd began to murmur more loudly, voices rising in panic. Father Benedict called for calm, called for prayer, but his voice was drowned out by the growing fear. People began hurrying away, back to their cottages, as if staying inside might somehow protect them from what was coming. Thomas walked home slowly, his mind churning. Alice was at the door, having heard the commotion in the square, and she looked at him with frightened eyes. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is the plague really coming?" "I don't know," Thomas said honestly. "Maybe. Probably." But Alice, We can't do anything about it. We can't run. We have nowhere to go, and we're too weak to travel anyway. We can only do what we've always done. We endure. We survive as best we can. And we trust in God, I suppose, though I'm not sure anymore what good that does. Alice took his hand and squeezed it tightly. Then we'll face it together, she said quietly. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That night, lying in their bed with the children pressed close, Thomas thought about the merchant's words. The great mortality, the pestilence. A plague that killed without mercy, without distinction. And he realized something strange. He was almost relieved. Not because he wanted to die, not because he wanted his family to die, but because at least this was something beyond anyone's control. If the plague came and took them, it wouldn't be because of the Lord's demands or the steward's cruelty, or the endless, grinding poverty that had defined their lives. It would just be fate, or God's will, or blind chance. There was an odd kind of freedom in that thought, but the days passed, and the plague did not come to their village. They heard more stories, of neighboring villages being struck, of whole families dying, of mass graves being dug, because there weren't enough coffins or enough healthy people to dig individual graves. But somehow, for reasons no one could explain, their village was spared. Whether it was God's mercy or simple luck or their isolation from the main trade routes, the great mortality passed them by. What did come as March turned to April was the first real warmth of spring. The sun grew stronger, the mud began to dry, and most importantly, the first green shoots appeared in the fields and along the hedgerows. Wild garlic, dandelion greens, nettles, the spring plants that could mean the difference between life and death for starving people. Alice went out foraging every day, taking Margaret with her, and they brought back baskets of greens that she boiled into a kind of potage. It wasn't much. The greens were bitter and provided little nourishment, but it was something, and slowly, gradually, the terrible gnawing hunger began to ease just slightly. The children stopped crying quite so much. Edmund grew a little stronger. Thomas found he could work without feeling quite so close to collapse. And then came the day when they could finally begin the spring planting. It was late April, and the ground was finally soft enough to work. Thomas reported for his labor service and was assigned, along with many others, to plowing the Lord's fields in preparation for planting. It was hard work, guiding the heavy plow behind the manor's oxen, keeping the furrows straight, breaking up the soil that had been frozen and compacted all winter. But it was good work too, in a way. It meant the cycle was continuing, meant another harvest would come, meant survival was possible for at least one more year. As Thomas walked behind the plow, his bare feet sinking into the soft earth, he thought about all he had endured to reach this moment. The cold, the hunger, the pain, the fear. The damaged feet that would never fully heal, that would always ache in cold weather, that bore the scars of this terrible winter. The anger that had taken root in his heart and would not easily be uprooted. The changes he had seen in himself, in his family, in his village. They had survived. Not everyone had. The village had lost perhaps a dozen people over the winter, to cold, to hunger, to disease, to accident. But Thomas and his family were still here, still alive, still fighting. Was that victory? He didn't know. It didn't feel like victory. It just felt like existence, like the simple fact of continuing to breathe and move and work. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps survival was its own kind of triumph, especially in a world that seemed designed to crush people like him. He had walked barefoot through snow, had felt the bite of frostbite, had stared into the face of death and somehow walked away. He had watched his children starve and had found ways to feed them. He had endured punishments and debts and endless, grinding labor, and he was still standing. As the spring sun warmed his back and the smell of freshly turned earth filled his nostrils, Thomas allowed himself a moment of something that might have been hope. The worst was behind them now. Summer would come, the harvest would come, and maybe, just maybe, next winter wouldn't be quite so brutal. Maybe they would have more food stored up. Maybe his feet would be stronger. Maybe the anger burning in his chest would transform into something else, something more like determination or resilience. Or maybe next winter would be even worse. Maybe the plague would come then, or another bad harvest, or a new cruelty from the Lord. There was no way to know, no way to prepare for every possibility. All they could do was what they had always done: endure, survive, hope for better days while preparing for worse ones. Thomas reached the end of the furrow and turned the plow to begin another. His feet ached, his back ached, his empty stomach cramped with hunger, but he was alive. His family was alive. And in the spring of 1348, in a small village in Sussex whose name would never be written in any history book, that was enough. The spring planting season stretched through April and into May, and Thomas worked the Lord's fields with a determination born of desperation. Every seed planted was a promise of future food. Every furrow plowed was a step away from the winter they had barely survived. The work was hard, but there was a rhythm to it that Thomas found almost meditative. The steady pace of walking behind the oxen, the bite of the plow into earth, the smell of soil and growing things. His body slowly adjusted to having slightly more food in his belly. Alice's foraging expeditions had become more successful as spring progressed, and she brought home not just greens, but also birds' eggs stolen from nests, mushrooms found in the Lord's forest, even an occasional fish caught in the river when the bailiff wasn't watching. It was still illegal. The fish belonged to the Lord, as did the birds and the mushrooms and essentially everything that grew or lived on the manor lands. But Alice had become skilled at moving quietly, at taking just enough that it wouldn't be noticed, at teaching Margaret the same careful stealth. Thomas found that he no longer cared much about the legality of it. Something fundamental had shifted in him over the winter. He had always accepted the rules that governed his life, had believed in the natural order of things, that the Lord ruled and the villeins served, that this was God's design, that accepting one's station was a virtue. But watching Edmund nearly die, feeling his own body fail from hunger while knowing that the manor house held stores of grain, meat, and wine that could have fed his family for a year. It had broken something in him. Or perhaps it had awakened something. He could no longer quite believe that God intended for children to starve while nobles feasted. He was careful never to speak such thoughts aloud, except in the most guarded conversations with Hugh. But the thoughts were there, growing stronger, and he knew he was not alone in harboring them. There was a new tension in the village, an undercurrent of resentment that hadn't been there before. People had always grumbled about the Lord's demands, of course, but this was different. This was harder, sharper, more dangerous. One evening in early May, as Thomas was walking home from the fields, he encountered a stranger on the road, a thin man in ragged clothes, with wild eyes and a voice that carried the rhythms of preaching. "Brothers," the man called out as Thomas and several other workers passed. "Stop and hear the word of truth. The world is changing. God has sent the great mortality as a sign. The high shall be brought low, and the low shall be raised up. The lords and ladies die the same as beggars now, and their wealth cannot save them. This is the beginning of a new age." Thomas wanted to keep walking to avoid trouble, but something made him stop. He wasn't the only one. Several other men had paused to listen, their faces reflecting the same mixture of curiosity and caution that Thomas felt. "Who are you?" Hugh asked the stranger. "I am Brother Martin, though I am a brother to no monastery now. I have left the cloister because God's work is here, among the people, not hidden behind abbey walls. I have seen the plague with my own eyes, have ministered to the dying, and I tell you, it is a great leveling. The pestilence makes no distinction between noble and commoner, between rich and poor. We are all equal in the eyes of death, and we should be equal in the eyes of the law." "That's heresy," someone muttered, but without much conviction. "Is it heresy to speak truth?" Brother Martin countered. "Is it heresy to say that all men are born naked and helpless, that all men return to dust? Jesus himself was a carpenter's son, born in a stable among animals. He chose fishermen and tax collectors as his followers, not princes and priests. The great will be humbled, and the humble will be exalted. These are Christ's own words, not mine." Thomas found himself nodding, drawn in despite himself. The man was speaking dangerous ideas, the kind that could get them all in trouble just for listening. But they were also ideas that resonated with something deep inside him, something that had been awakened by the long winter and all its suffering. "What are you saying we should do?" Hugh asked, voicing the question Thomas was thinking. Brother Martin's eyes gleamed. "I say you should remember your worth. Remember that without your labor the lords would have nothing. Their fine clothes, their full bellies, their warm manor houses, all of it comes from your sweat, your blood, your broken backs. You are not less than them in God's eyes. You have value. You have rights, even if the law does not recognize them. The law says we're bound to the land," Thomas heard himself say. "Says we owe service to the Lord. Says our children are born into the same bondage." "The law is made by men," Brother Martin replied. "And what men make, men can unmake. The plague is teaching us this, showing us that all the old certainties can crumble, that the world can change in ways we never imagined. Perhaps God sent it for this very purpose, to shake us from our complacency, to show us that change is possible. Before anyone could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the road. The men scattered quickly, not wanting to be caught listening to such dangerous talk. Brother Martin melted into the trees beside the road, and Thomas hurried home, his heart pounding not with fear but with something else, a strange excitement, a sense of possibility he had never felt before. That night, he told Alice about the encounter, speaking quietly so the children wouldn't hear. "He sounds like a madman," Alice said, her face worried. "Thomas, you must stay away from such people. If the Lord hears that you've been listening to talk of rebellion." "It wasn't rebellion," Thomas interrupted. "It was just truth. Alice, don't you ever feel angry about how we live? Don't you ever wish things could be different?" Alice was quiet for a long moment, her hands continuing their work of mending one of William's torn tunics. "Of course I do," she said finally. "Every mother wishes her children could grow up with full bellies and warm clothes, and a future that holds more than endless labor. But wishing doesn't make it so. And anger is dangerous, Thomas. It clouds judgment. It leads to actions that bring punishment." "Maybe punishment is worth it," Thomas said, surprising himself with the words. "Maybe some things are worth fighting for, even if it means risk." Alice looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw fear in her eyes. "Don't talk like that," she whispered urgently. "Please, Thomas. I need you alive. The children need you alive. Whatever ideas that preacher put in your head, push them out. We survived the winter. We're going to make it. Don't throw that away chasing impossible dreams." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that the dreams weren't impossible, that the world was changing, that Brother Martin was right. But he saw the fear in her face, remembered how close they had come to losing everything, and he kept silent. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps survival was enough. Perhaps he should be grateful for what they had instead of reaching for what they could never have. But the seed had been planted, and Thomas found he couldn't quite root it out, no matter how hard he tried. The weeks passed, and spring slowly transformed into summer. The fields grew green with new crops, and Thomas worked both the Lord's land and his own family's strip with renewed vigor. His feet had healed as much as they ever would. The scars and calluses remained, and he would always walk with a slight limp now, his frost-damaged toes unable to bend quite properly. But he was alive, he was working, and the coming harvest looked promising. Young William worked beside him now, learning the rhythms of farming, when to plant, when to weed, when to harvest. The boy had changed over the winter, had lost some of the lightness of childhood and gained a somber understanding of how hard life could be. Thomas saw himself in his son, saw the same resignation settling into place, and it filled him with a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride that William was strong, capable, learning what he needed to survive. sorrow that survival was the best future Thomas could offer him. Margaret, too, was growing up quickly. At 7 years old, she was already learning to spin wool, to help her mother with cooking and cleaning, to forage for food. She had learned to move quietly through the forest, to identify which plants were edible and which were poisonous, to find birds' nests without disturbing them too much. She was becoming the kind of practical, resourceful woman that was necessary for survival in their world. But Thomas mourned the curious, questioning child she had been before the winter had taught her to focus on more immediate concerns. Only Edmund seemed unchanged, still too young to understand what they had all been through. He toddled around the cottage now, babbling happily, reaching for everything with chubby hands. Looking at him, Thomas could almost forget the terrifying night when they had thought they would lose him. Almost, but not quite. The memory was burned into Thomas's mind, a reminder of how fragile everything was, how quickly it could all be lost. In June came the first haying, when the grass in the meadows was cut and dried for winter fodder for the Lord's animals. Thomas was assigned to this work along with most of the other villeins, and they spent long days in the meadows, swinging scythes in rhythm, turning the cut grass to help it dry, then gathering it into large haystacks. It was exhausting work, but there was a kind of satisfaction in it. The meadows smelled sweet. The sun was warm but not yet oppressively hot, and for once, Thomas's feet didn't hurt. The thick grass was soft and cool, and walking barefoot through it was almost pleasant. But the peace of the haying season was broken when news reached them that the plague had struck again, this time much closer. A village only 15 miles away had been devastated, more than half the population dead within a fortnight. The survivors had fled, leaving their homes and fields abandoned, and now the disease was spreading to neighboring villages. The news sent a wave of terror through Thomas's village. People began avoiding each other, afraid that any contact might spread the contagion. Some families barricaded themselves in their cottages, refusing to come out except for the most necessary tasks. Father Benedict held special prayer services, calling on God to spare them, but his words seemed hollow even to him. They had been spared once in the spring, but who was to say they would be spared again? Thomas found that he felt strangely calm in the face of this renewed threat. Perhaps it was because he had already faced death so many times over the winter that the plague seemed like just one more danger in a world full of dangers. Or perhaps the seed of anger that Brother Martin had planted had grown into something that made him less afraid. If the world was unjust, if survival was a matter of blind luck rather than virtue, then what was the point of fear? He continued working, continued providing for his family, continued walking barefoot through the fields and forests just as he always had. And when the plague reached a village only 5 miles away, killing the lord of that manor along with most of his household, Thomas felt something that might have been grim satisfaction. See, the plague did not discriminate. The rich died just like the poor. For once, there was a kind of equality in the world, even if it was the equality of death. But the satisfaction curdled when the plague finally did reach their village in mid-July. It started with the Smith's family. His wife fell ill one morning, complaining of terrible pains in her neck and armpits. By evening, she was burning with fever, vomiting blood, covered in the dark swellings that everyone now recognized as the signs of the pestilence. By the next morning, she was dead. Within a week, a dozen families had been struck. The disease moved through the village like wildfire, jumping from house to house with no apparent pattern. It took the young and the old, the strong and the weak. The smith lost his wife and 3 of his 5 children. The miller lost both his parents. The bailiff lost his brother, and still the plague spread. Father Benedict did what he could, ministering to the sick, administering last rites, organizing the burial of the dead. But he was one man, and there were too many sick, too many dying. Soon he stopped even trying to give proper burials. The bodies were dragged to a large pit on the edge of the village and thrown in together, noble and commoner alike, all mixed together in death's great leveling. Thomas waited for the disease to come to his family, certain that it was only a matter of time. Every morning he woke expecting to feel the telltale pains, the fever, the swellings. Every night he checked his children carefully, looking for signs of illness. But days passed, then weeks, and they remained healthy while all around them people sickened and died. It made no sense. They had no special protection, no better food or cleaner water than anyone else. If anything, they were more vulnerable, weakened by the winter's starvation, living in close quarters in their small cottage. But the plague passed them by, taking their neighbors, their friends, but leaving them untouched. Hugh was not so lucky. Thomas went to visit him one evening and found his friend lying on his bed, his face gray with pain, his neck grotesquely swollen with the buboes. Hugh's elderly mother sat beside him, weeping quietly, and Thomas felt his heart break. Hugh had been his closest friend, the man who had helped him survive the winter, who had shared his food and his warmth and his strength. Thomas, Hugh gasped when he saw him. "You shouldn't be here. You'll catch it." "I don't care," Thomas said, kneeling beside the bed. It was true, he didn't care. If he was going to get the plague, he would get it regardless. And he wouldn't abandon his friend in his final hours. He stayed with Hugh through the night, bringing him water when he could drink, cooling his fever with damp cloths, simply sitting with him so he wouldn't die alone. Hugh's mother dozed fitfully in the corner, exhausted by days of nursing her son. As dawn approached, Hugh's breathing grew ragged, and Thomas held his friend's hand, feeling the life slowly leaving him. "Take care of my mother," Hugh whispered. "Promise me." "I promise," Thomas said and meant it. Hugh smiled faintly, and then he was gone, his hand going limp in Thomas's grasp. Thomas sat there for a long moment, still holding his dead friend's hand, feeling the weight of loss settle over him like a heavy cloak. Another good man gone, another reminder of how fragile life was, how quickly everything could end. He thought of all the times Hugh had helped him, all the conversations they had shared, all the years of friendship. And now Hugh was just another body for the pit, another casualty of the pestilence that was consuming their world. He helped Hugh's mother prepare the body, washing it and wrapping it in the cleanest cloth they could find. Then he carried Hugh outside and added him to the cart that made daily rounds, collecting the dead. Hugh's mother wept as her son was taken away, and Thomas stood beside her with his arm around her thin shoulders, offering what comfort he could. When he finally returned home, Alice took one look at his face and pulled him into her arms. "Hugh," she asked quietly, and Thomas nodded against her shoulder. She held him while he finally allowed himself to grieve, his body shaking with silent sobs, mourning not just Hugh but everything. The winter they had endured, the suffering they had witnessed, the friends they had lost, the world that seemed determined to break them.